It's lovely to see you all this afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Katie Dick and I'm one of the fellows of the Schumacher Institute and pleased to chair today's session. I'd like to welcome Alice Beck, who is a PhD student at the University of Bristol. She has a background in human geography and her PhD includes a fascinating topic of the links between racism and health and the microbiome. So last year she did a 5-month placement with the Schumacher Institute, and today she's presenting an updated version of the work that she did then. So I'm going to leave Alice to introduce herself more fully in a moment. Just to kind of say about the format of the session. So we're going to have a talk and then a short Q&A session, and then we'll go into breakout groups to discuss some interesting and very topical questions that Alice will put to us. And then we'll come back to the main group for some further Q&A and discussion. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Alice. Thank you, Alice.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Right, cool. Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, as Katie said, I'm Alice. I'm a third-year PhD student from the University of Bristol. And I was thinking the stuff that I'm presenting is, the stuff I was working on at the Schumacher Institute this time last year, which is funny how it comes around. So I'm first going to explain what I mean when I refer to the systems of racism. And then I'm going to look at how racism impacts health. I'll then give an introduction to the microbiome and finally posit how racism may interact with the microbiome. So the microbiome field is still in its relative infancy, meaning lots of research is yet to be done. So I collate current findings and consider the modes through which racism may impact the microbiome. And that's really the main thesis of the talk, is that racism should be considered within microbiome research. So the workshop will then invite members to consider the relationship between health and race, relating it to their own areas in the workshop section. So before we get into it, I just need to disclaim, I'm going to be going over a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. So if you have any questions, please ask me at the end. I'm going to have to brush over a few bits. And also before we begin, I'm using these acronyms. So BAME is Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic, and BME, Black, Minority Ethnic. So, starting with race and racism. When I refer to race, I'm referring to the social construct where classification or group membership has been decided by people within particular social systems at particular historical moments. Race isn't fixed and doesn't have any biological basis, but the social construction of it has very real world effects. So what is racism? When I refer to racism, I'm referring to a system of social structures that provides or denies access, safety, resources, and power based on race categories and produces and reproduces race-based inequalities. It's something that affects individuals, but it is also reproduced and upheld by institutions and woven into our culture. As Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, mentions, racism should be revised as a system rather than an event. So what are some of those systems? Systemic racism can be understood to manifest and be upheld by institutional, interpersonal, and internalized racism, as this little infographic depicts. So moving on to some examples and explanations. Systemic racism can be understood as the multiple institutions that collectively uphold racist policies. We then have institutional racism. This can be understood as policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workspace or organization. And some examples of that include persistent BME attainment gaps in higher education, and that Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people in the UK. So we then have interpersonal racism. And this can be understood as racist acts of microaggressions that are carried out from one person to another. So microaggressions can be understood as verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to targeted persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. Microaggressions are usually performed by well-intentioned people who are unaware of their behaviors or consequences of such behaviors, as they've never experienced that type of discrimination. By positioning a member of a marginalized group as other, inferior, or outside of the majority, microaggressions have a powerful impact upon the psychological well-being of marginalized groups. So an example of that is asking people of color where they're really from, or white people asking Black people if they can touch their hair. So lastly, we have internalized racism. And this exists in individuals' conscious or subconscious acceptance of a racial hierarchy in which white people are consistently ranked above people of color. And these manifest in individuals' assumptions, attitudes, and behaviors. So moving on to systemic racism and health. So the social stress that's caused by structural racism is significant and has already been shown to affect health in a number of ways. So we have here David Williams from Harvard University, and he came up with the everyday discrimination scale and argues that the impact of perceived discriminatory interactions, such as common microaggressions, over time can lead to chronic adverse physiological effects. We then have Sherman James from Duke University, and he referred to the John Henryism hypothesis, and that predicts that those that experience racial discrimination engage in high effort coping mechanisms in order to thrive. And this will inevitably damage their health through stress, leading to cardiovascular issues. Lastly, we have Winston Morgan from University of East London. And he refers to inflammaging, which can be understood as premature aging. And this is caused by prolonged exposure to stress-related hormones, such as adrenaline. And this negatively impacts the cardiovascular system and immune system. He also points to the added risks that Black people are faced with as within medical spaces, as diagnosis and treatment are often ignorant to the psychological and physiological experiences and impacts of systemic racism. Hence, Morgan stresses that both everyday discrimination and the associated physiological and psychological implications, combined with negligent and poor diagnosis and treatment, results in poorer medical outcomes for Black people, and he argues makes them more susceptible to certain diseases. And he uses COVID-19 as an example, and I'll explain a bit more about that later on. So, a notorious example of the impact that racial injustice and the stress it has to physical health can be seen in the persistently higher rates of adverse birth outcomes among Black women across the UK and the US. So I have several studies on this. I can't go into that much detail about it now because I don't have time, but they'll be available in the bibliography. But here we have Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, recently highlighting this issue in the PMQs. As he points out, Black women in the UK are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. So far, we've looked at race and racism and had a look at some of the health implications of that, which have been researched thus far, and looking specifically at stress, cardiovascular issues, and birth rates. So now we're going to move on to an introduction to the microbiome. So the microbiome can be understood as the vast array of microbial ecologies that cover the insides and outsides of the body, with the gut being a space where a concentrated number of microbial life live. So the microbiome enables everyday functions such as digestion, but it's also being increasingly shown to be very important in many aspects of human health. So having a look at the microbiome's role in human health, starting with the immune system. So the human immune system evolved with the presence of microbial life. So for it to develop properly, contact with microbial life is very important. However, due to processes of westernization, microbiome diversity and contact with microbial life is decreasing. So for Western populations, this is negatively impacting immune system development. And the impact of this can be seen in the increasing number of autoimmune conditions within the West. So autoimmunity can broadly be understood as the immune system being in inflammation mode constantly and causing it to attack the body's own cells. So some gut-related autoimmune conditions include IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, and some other autoimmune conditions, multiple sclerosis and diabetes. We then have the gut-brain axis, So the gut-brain axis represents a material bidirectional connection between the brain and the gut microbiome. It's understood that when exposed to stress, host microbe interactions change the composition of the gut microbiome. These changes can consequently influence immune system activity due to inflammation. Now, I'm sure everyone here has felt butterflies in their stomach when they're nervous, or for some, experiencing stress-related IBS. So, some factors that influence the microbiome. So much like you inherit your genetics from your parents, you also inherit your microbiome from your parents. We also have infancy, which is a crucial time for microbiome development. And this occurs largely between birth and 3 years old. And in that time, what people refer to as a core microbiome is formed, but it then develops throughout a child's life. And the next dramatic change is experienced during puberty. So during infancy, appropriate microbial stimulation has an irreplaceable effect on the maturation of the immune system. And key spaces include birthing methods, so vaginal or C-section, and a feeding method. So was it breast formula or breast milk or formula? And at what point was the child put onto solids? We then have diet and environment. So diet composition throughout a person's life is extremely important, and long-term dietary changes appear to be significant in improving some health conditions. We then have environment. So time spent in microbially diverse natural spaces, such as forests and non-polluted spaces, can be beneficial for diversifying the microbiome compared to microbially sparse spaces, such as in air-conditioned spaces or heavily polluted environments. So meeting the systems of racism with the microbiome. So a call for greater awareness of and inclusion of the socio-cultural factors that affect the microbiome is being made by some within the microbiome research community. So here we have Findlay et al. Suggesting that uncovering the role of the microbiome in health disparities could enhance our understanding of why some populations have poor survival rates, greater severity of diseases, and overall elevated disease risks compared to others. We also have Fortenberry, who suggests that ignorance to the social cultural context of data carries the risk of reproducing negative or damaging stereotypes that run along racial or ethnic lines. So an example of this can be seen with COVID-19, where Black people are more likely to be hospitalized and die from coronavirus. So if we look at the graph on the slide taken from the ONS COVID-related deaths by ethnicity, published in May 2020, we can see that Black men and women are 4 times as likely to die from COVID compared to their white counterparts. So Winston Morgan, who I mentioned earlier, highlights that because these numbers are so consistent across the UK and the US, many people assume that there must be a genetic reason. However, there are no genetic determinants that would cause Black people to be at a higher risk. Instead, he reasons that it's due to processes such as inflammaging and poor medical intervention that we have this, the high rates of Black people dying from COVID. So the risks of not considering racism are twofold. Firstly, there are the risks of missing important factors that could contribute to the microbiome's development and role in certain groups, while also facing the risk of reproducing damaging stereotypes. So the call for such inclusion within microbiome research has thus far not been answered. And the impact, or if it has, people haven't looked very specifically at systemic racism and the microbiome within the West. So taking into consideration what we already know about microbiome research and the health implications of systemic racism, let's consider how systemic racism might impact the microbiome. So firstly, we have stress, which I think is perhaps most obvious, and I think most important. So we know that due to the gut-brain axis, stress can negatively damage the microbiome, and systemic racism is a source of chronic stress for people of color. Hence, it seems logical to propose that systemic racism will negatively impact the microbiome. So let's dig into that a little bit. If we inherit our microbiome from our parents, what might the long-term impacts of chronic stress do for microbial diversity? And historic events such as 15th century slave trade seem particularly interesting here. What are the long-term implications of persistent exposure to extreme trauma? Alongside this, if you think about how important infancy is in developing the immune system, another thing to question is the impact of being exposed to stress from infancy and throughout childhood, as well as exposure to parental stress. So moving on to the second factor that could impact BAME populations' microbiomes, we have environment and deprivation. So across the UK, the most deprived wards are those with the highest air pollution concentrations. BAME populations contribute the highest percentage of the population in the most deprived areas in the UK. And as The Guardian recently reported, nearly half of BAME UK households are living in poverty. So if we look at the graph on the left, we have the percentage of people living in the most deprived 10% of neighbourhoods by ethnicity in England. And we have the highest percentages being Pakistani, Bangladeshi, mixed white Caribbean, and then Black. So what are the microbial implications of racialized environmental injustice? What is that doing for lung microbiomes, for example? And more broadly, what's it doing for the development of microbiome diversity? So we have the last factor that could contribute to BAME populations' microbiomes, and that's diet. So diet is a key space of microbial intervention and key indicator of culture. However, deprivation is a significant determinant of access to food. As is well reported on, the highest concentrations of fast food outlets exist in the more deprived areas across the UK. And an example of this is Chicken Mile in East London on Mile End Road. And it's got the highest concentration of fast food chicken shops per square mile than anywhere else in the UK. And although it's experiencing a change of demographic due to gentrification, it has one of the highest populations of Asian Bangladeshi people in London. So we also have an overrepresentation of Black people using food banks, and as a population, they represent a group that are at a higher risk of experiencing food insecurity. So if we again consider exposure to this from infancy and throughout a person's life, and in combination with environment and stress, what might the microbial implications be of this? So using Bristol to think through some of these examples with. If we look to the left side of this slide, we can see where the highest percentage of BAME populations are within Bristol, so it's in the centre and moving out to the east. And if we look to the right of the slide, we can see some of the most deprived areas are also within the centre, mapping out onto the east. So the areas of deprivation across Bristol have poor environmental conditions with high noise and air pollution and a high quantity of fast food outlets. As you'll see, there are areas in Bristol that have high areas of deprivation, but they're predominantly white. And people living in these areas will suffer from negative health impacts that come with that, from environmental pollution and high numbers of fast food outlets. However, it's important to note here that these white populations won't have the added negative health implications associated with systemic racism. And it's important to note this because this isn't consistently recognized within government and policy settings. So it's not to say that white people don't suffer from environmental exposures. Rather, it's to bring attention to the added implications that systemic racism might have. So some things that I've said today will not come as a surprise. We know that air pollution is bad for us, we know that stress is bad for us, and we know that fast food is bad for us. However, what is novel is considering the potential role of systemic racism on the microbiome. And as I've demonstrated, taking what we already know about the functioning of the microbiome, the mechanics of the microbiome, and what we know about racism, it's highly likely that they interact together through stress exposure, environment, and diet. So this needs to be recognized within microbiome research, as without such an awareness, and as the COVID-19 example demonstrates, there are risks that observed differences are explained through racial and ethnic categorization rather than observing the underlying and contributing social context. Furthermore, looking at racism in the microbiome could indicate the mechanics by which systemic racism is directly impacting the microbiome, causing, which may provide some interventions and hopefully a better awareness within the microbiome community. So that's been my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I have the bibliography, if anyone would like to take anything from it. And I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Alice, for setting that all out so clearly when it's such a vast and complex topic. Could you possibly stop sharing your screen for the time being? Thank you, then I can see everyone. Yeah, we now have time for some questions. Does anyone have any questions at this point? So if you would either like to put up your hand, oh, okay, we've got one from, so you can put up your hand in two ways. You can either use the electronic system, or I think we're a small enough group such that you can just wave at me. I think, Ted, would you like to ask the first question?
Hi, yes, I'm just aware that the Public Health City Council published data about health outcomes per ward, but I didn't see that referred to. I may have missed it in your presentation, Alice. So you had deprivation and you had race, or but not health outcome data that was comparable. So have you got any of that we can look at?
I don't have any of that to hand, no. But I did look at that during my time at the Schumacher Institute last year. But yeah, this is just a revision of that, so I don't have that to hand at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been involved in this discussion for about 40 years since there was a report issued around inequalities in health and poverty based on the work in the Black report in the late 70s, and then later on more specific in Bristol, and then there was further work done on race and health in the mid to late 80s when I was active in politics and read those reports and worked on those reports in various committees. I'm just wondering if that correlation has been updated. Your focus on biome, so I don't even use the word, but has made is a different it's a different intervention than one I've come across. So I'm very interested. But okay, I'll try and find some. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll mute.
Thank you. Any further questions? We've got some. Richard, over to you.
Hi. This is a very extremely interesting area. The whole world of microbiome research, I think, is in its relative infancy. I'd be interested to know, in the current times of tracking and tracing and assessing the viruses, where the technology and the science is with respect to actually analysing, sampling the microbiome to as it were get the scientific data. Is that something which is sort of imminent or actually happening?
So largely they use genetic RNA sampling techniques and to look at the taxonomic presence of microbial life, and that's pretty it's relatively cheap now, so that you can get your own microbiome tested if you wanted to. But I think an interesting thing around looking at the taxonomic presence of microbial life is that microbial ecologies can perform the same function with a different presence of microbial life, if that makes sense. So different microbial ecologies can perform the same function. So taxonomic presence isn't as, I mean, it's a good indicator of what kind of microbial life is there. And if you have a very undiverse microbiome, then it would indicate that. But I think it's an interesting question to try and figure out what is there, what function it performs is more interesting, really. But yeah, that's the kind of summary of now, really. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? One from Julian and then Ian.
Hi there. Yes, that fascinating stuff. I'm just wondering, my little notes here, my take-home message, it seems to be that so white people and people of color can have deprivation and air pollution and poor diets, but the difference in morbidity and mortality, as you mentioned earlier, are due to the added stress from the racist component. Is that a correct summary of what you said?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's also interesting to think about class when it comes to the microbiome, because that, diet and environment are key spaces of microbial exposure. But I think what's important specifically with race is that it isn't consistently recognized, and it does have a significant role.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that really distinguishes class from race, really. It's just that it's the added weight of and ignorance to that currently. Yeah.
Well, on that front, one will wonder what the differences are between, say, Jacob Rees-Mogg's gut flora and anybody else's, if you were to class. But, well, I mean, you could spend the rest of your life studying all the ins and outs of this complicated thing. I mean, are you moving towards a situation where a sort of multivariate analysis can start teasing these things, these influences out?
I think realistically, and probably, realistically, I think current research that looks at the microbiome as a baseline should be aware of how race might impact the data sets, so that conclusions aren't drawn along racial and ethnic lines when they're ignorant to the social cultural context. That, I think, is the main baseline to go from with microbiome research so far, because realistically, where the money is in microbiome research is not looking at this kind of stuff. It's looking at intervention for products that can be sold. And there are many microbiome papers that draw racist conclusions, basically drawing conclusions suggesting that it's because of race or ethnicity, when actually it's ignorant to stress or cultural practice or something like that.
Huh. Could I just ask one little supplementary question then? On your first slide, you had this spread of Black and Asian, different ethnicities anyway, but they have quite a big difference between Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian. And I sort of wrote to myself, Muslim, Islam, question mark, on my notes. I mean, is that what you mean by the kind of cultural differences that could be teased out?
Yeah, well, like different groups of people have different cultural practices that, I'm not from any of those communities, as you can tell, but like hygiene practices or like diet is a pretty big cultural indicator of like what fibers or proteins and stuff like that. But coming back to what you said about Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think that is also interesting, and bringing in an intersection of class and race would also be interesting and important to think about in that setting. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. And Ian, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. I wonder whether you had any further thoughts on the idea that we toyed around with a year or so ago about monitoring at a gross level the microbiome of communities by analysing sewage waste, particularly in the light that we now see that this is a technique being used to detect COVID outbreaks and things like that. And is that something that we might be able to work with any further? I know it was almost a light-hearted concept when we first talked about it, but there is a possibility there, I feel, of getting the measure of community level microbiome out of that sort of technique. Any further thoughts on it?
I think technically it would be possible, I guess. I think it would be an interesting exploration. But I think like the logistics of it, I don't know who or how that research would get funded or done. But yeah, I've spoken to some people that they're also testing for drug consumption by looking at sewage and all sorts of stuff. So it definitely seems like a place where that kind of thing can be looked into further.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that brings up another secondary point about drugs and medicines in particular, sort of almost destroying the microbiome occasionally. Is that another factor that complicates everything by the consumption of certain types of medicines by different communities? You know, there's a sort of sense that tranquilizers may end up de-stressing people and might improve their microbiome. On the other hand, an overuse of antibiotic could actually destroy their microbiomes for a while, and they have to then recover. And do they recover back to where they were? So, you know, there's quite a lot of complicating factors in this, aren't there? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure what, if there is, I'm unaware of the kind of cultural behaviors associated with antibiotic consumption, but antibiotics definitely do or can negatively impact the microbiome because they're non-discriminatory. They kind of wipe out everything that's there. So consistent or persistent consumption of antibiotics over a period of time would be bad for the microbiome. But I'm not sure, I'm unaware of like specific cultural practices that might be associated with that.
And might we all be starting to ingest more antibiotics through meat consumption that contains it as well? So there's another huge area of complication into all this. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, guys. Katie, I think there's a question coming from Ona.
Over to you, Ona. Thanks, Ian. Ona, are we right that you wanted to ask a question? Ona, no? Pat's not hearing me. Okay. Anyone else who wanted to ask a question? Jen. Oh, sorry, Jen first, and then back to you, Ted.
Oh, that's okay. Ted can go first if he
Sorry,
was before me.
I was just pointing you out, Jen. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, carry on.
Thank you, Ted. Alice, this isn't specifically about your research, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I was just curious how you personally came to be interested in this, if you don't mind sharing it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I get asked this question quite a lot, actually. But I initially got interested in kind of looking at the microbiome through using visual discourse analysis in my master's and looking at it was toilet cleaner adverts and the kind of depiction of microbial life as this kind of conniving, evil thing that was going to like hurt you and your family, whereas probiotics are kind of represented as this kind of goofy, fumbling, like very stupid but helpful character, kind of thinking about the binary between good and bad bacteria. And then I started to speak to Microbiome, who's they're a fecal bank in America, and they're doing some really amazing stuff for fecal microbiota transplantation, donation supplies and research, and they got me really interested in more into the microbiome specifically. And then I started doing my PhD thinking about how that knowledge is made and what implications it has in the world. But yeah, So I hope it gives you a good summary.
That's great stuff. No, thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Yes, indeed, great stuff and fascinating. Any more questions? Ona, were you wanting to ask a question? No, okay. Yes, oh, okay, I couldn't see your hand before. Yeah, go for it. You need to unmute. And then we'll go to Elizabeth.
Hello there. It's Chris Jordan, actually, coming up on as owner. No, I was intrigued. Basically, the historically, I've worked in East London in the Bangladeshi community, and also worked in South London in the Camberwell in the Black community, particularly on the mental health side and addictions. And I was really speculating to myself on the long-term effect of the biome on the mental health outcomes. Whether any additional research has been done on that recently. As one of the colleagues mentioned earlier on, it was the Black report about 40 years ago that initially drew attention to the immigrant populations in London and their poor outcomes on the mental health front, as well as the sort of hidden threats to cardiovascular disease as well within that community. And there seems to be a very full minefield of work that can be done in that area. But I was particularly interested in the mental health aspect of the sort of the gut-brain axis and the paradigm that's it's a sort of two-way street, really, on that. So yes, it's great what you've done, and there's more to be done yet, I'm sure, in this. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question. Thank you for asking. So I know that with the microbiome gut-brain axis research, there's a lot of research looking at like depression signatures in the microbiome. So depression certain microbiome ecologies will be similar across groups with depression. I haven't looked into the studies that have that correlate with race yet, but I'm sure that there's a crossover for sure, definitely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting. I think it's a really fascinating concept, thinking about how related your gut and your brain are, and I think it really brings mental health into a biological kind of material realm that should be. Mental health is starting to get taken more seriously, but I think it kind of encourages that for it to be taken more seriously through kind of thinking about how it materially manifests and kind of the long-term implications of it on your body. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research going on about sort of gut flora and allergies, and in autoimmune disorders as well going on at the moment. So there's a vast field, as I said, information to be uncovered. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Thanks. Interesting. Elizabeth, I think you had a question, and then I think we'll make that the last question before we then go into small groups for some discussions on questions that Alice will post in the chat for us. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. Very interesting. I'm just wondering, have you looked at links to the soil microbiome? Because with industrial agriculture using toxic chemicals, this knocks out mycorrhizal fungal networks in the soil, effectively like killing all microorganisms and affecting nutrient uptake, carbon and water uptake into plants. So I'm just thinking, and with the soil biome, microbiome being compared to the gut microbiome. Sorry, I'm sort of gibbering a bit. I know also there's sort of links between like toxic chemical use on crops and development of particular non-communicable diseases as well. So just wanting to sort of throw that into the mix, links with agricultural production systems and toxic chemicals. And it just made me think as well in terms of, you know, like say in inner cities, you tend to get the types of shops where fruit and veg is imported from developing countries. So I'm just wondering if there might be a link there with the quality of the fruit and veg that's imported, maybe from countries where regulations on use of toxic chemicals for farming practices is not as stringent as it should be. So effectively, sort of people are, you know, consuming fruit and veg that could be knocking out their gut microbiomes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think the quality of food is interesting because, as I mentioned, the fast food, overexposure to fast food in certain deprived areas. But I think it's overexposure to fast food, and then a underexposure to good quality food. And what is that food that's available? And where does it come from, as you mentioned? I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at Brexit in a while because I don't think I had to put the chefs on for a bit. But the concept of getting chlorinated chicken from America is very concerning for what that does to the microbiome. The pesticides that are used that within some of the foods within America that we might have a trade deal with are have been proven to be dangerous for consumption. So I think chlorinated chicken is definitely not good for the microbiome at all. And yeah, I think it's interesting talking about diet. It's not just what you're eating, but the quality of it, and what that means for your microbiome. I think it's a very interesting question. But yeah, I haven't specifically. I mean, there are people that are within my research circles that look at the soil microbiome, and there are a lot of similarities, and it's really interesting actually how it's being, like, the soil is being compared to kind of a gut microbiome, and thinking about the complexities of that and what farming practices do to the soil microbiome. Also another concerning part of climate change and the over-erosive processes of Western farming on the soil, degrading microbiome and hence the food quality. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and yeah, definitely, you know, what food we eat definitely impacts our microbiome for sure. But yeah, that's all really. Yeah, but thank you for the question.
Great. Well, yeah, that was a great range of questions, and this topic just gets more and more fascinating to me. So I'm now going to hand back to Alice to introduce our breakout groups, and we're going to go into breakout groups for 20 minutes to discuss some questions that Alice is going to put to us. So over to you, Alice.
Great. I've just sent the questions into the chat. So yeah, we're going to break out into breakout groups, and I've kind of got these questions here more as prompts. They don't need to be gone through methodically, but more used as conversation points. So how might the things I've spoken about today be reflected in your local area or the communities that you're part of? When or have you ever thought about your own race's relationship to health? If so, when? If not, why do you think that is? And how do you think the things that I've spoken about today have been impacted by COVID-19? So the plan is to go out into breakout groups. We'll come back, and then if one person from each group could kind of feedback what your group discussed, and maybe we could have some more conversation. Yeah, that's the that's the summary of it really. So I believe Ian's gonna put us into groups.
So Alice, they've not come up in the chat yet. Could you might need to press return, or perhaps I'm not seeing them.
Oh, for some reason. Oh, okay. There we go. Sorry, I sent a direct message to someone instead of. There we go.
Brilliant, brilliant. So yeah, I don't think the questions will be visible in the breakout groups, so you might want to copy and paste them. And yes, so Ian, if you could do the honours with the groups, short intros and then into these questions.
How many groups do we have? 3?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
3 groups.
3 groups.
Do.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, let's go for that. Yeah. I'll automatically create groups. There we go. Okay, folks, and that's Elizabeth and Julian. You have to join the group. Yeah. Which is me. You okay, Julian? You have to join the group, I think, somehow.
I only got the one option currently. I don't know what I can contribute about to any of them really, other than just. Should I should I join group 1 then? Room 1. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll join.
Yeah, you're assigned to group 1. Yeah, you join that. That's it. Right.
Hello, Ian. I'm not
Hello.
going to join a group. Hello. I've just got doing a few other things. Are we meeting tomorrow?
Yeah, 2 o'clock. Is that
2
okay?
o'clock? Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, doke.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
See you later.
See you later.
Good talk.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, very smart cookie.
Right. I'll go and join a group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, and there's correspondingly the death of the dairy industry that's had implications in the nature of the biome as well. So, yeah, it's a major feature in agricultural usage here, I think. Essentially, our relationship with the soil.
Yes. Yeah. I'm thinking also when it comes to children, their ability to have contact with the soil become, because their mums and dads don't let them get mucky anymore.
No.
I was struck. There was a Radio 2 program, I think, recently, and it was the relationship between the increase in allergy and everything else, and the lack of contact with the sort of the biome. Essentially the whole Freudian relationship of hand from earth to mouth to rectum, essentially has been broken. Yeah, which was we exposed ourselves to a sort of an amazing biome of thousands of microorganisms previously, whereas now it's much more limited to a sort of sterile few.
Adriana.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hi. I love that connection actually with the soil, because after all, that's the kind of original microbiome, isn't it? And we are really kind of a secondary kind of source, or tertiary source with this kind of fetid mass kind of being the nature of creativity, kind of. But something which is different from that is the obsession. I mean, Alice, I think, mentioned hygiene, and I think that kind of seemed a bit of a side note, but the obsession with sterility. I mean, it's really weird because sterility, which is, what is it? The absence of culture or creativity, is absolutely, what is it? It's like a signifier of our age.
I wonder if you were to sample the microbiome of gardeners, whether you'd find anything interesting. You know, they do say getting a bit of dirt under your fingernails is quite a good thing, because for one thing, there's stuff in the soil that secretes chemicals not unlike, I don't know, mild hallucinogenics, or, you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. After all, fungus
yeah,
and mushrooms, you know, I mean, the spores
yeah, yeah.
and everything. No, I can't. That seems as if it's probably got a root, into things. But also, I forgot to mention when I said about the sterility, that actually the cleaner you are, I mean, probably the clean white shirt is like an emblem, a badge of class. And to have a clean white shirt, you know, you know, something which is bleached and white, and if it's got a mark on it, you know, it's taken off and washed. So really, when the what is it, the highest examples of cultivation or civilization are sterile, then, you know, it's we know where we're going. We're going that way.
It's quite an interesting fact for me that I came across the other day, or idea, was that the relationship between animals and plant is like an ongoing relationship of co-evolution where there's a sense of warfare going on. Animals eat plants, but the plants are trying to defend themselves, and they develop all kinds of mechanisms to prevent that. Thistles and spikes and prickles and toxins and all kinds of ways to sort of try to prevent their destruction by the animals. So it's a complex relationship, and that would relate right way down to the microbial level as well. So it's not a straightforward picture of necessarily ingesting lots of stuff from the plant world. It's going to make you healthy. So there's always this problem about making sure that we filter out those harmful things. I suppose what we've attempted to do in the modern world is to say, let's get rid of all of it by going sterile, as you said, and that's the sort of, you know, path we've taken, is try to eliminate any potential for the harmful side of our relationship with plants and the microbial world. But in fact, we need somewhere in between. We need this sort of this balancing place where we derive the benefits from it, but we don't get killed by it either. So it's once again, it's a systemic
I mean,
that we need. Yeah, Chris. Yeah.
But Ian, something which doesn't contradict your point in any way, but is a kind of like a joker in a pack of cards, that GM crops, it seems the basis of why they were so profoundly had such a profoundly higher yield, was because they increased the poisons in seeds 100-fold, so that animals would be less likely to eat them. However, there's kind of research that expresses that these lectins, which were increased in poison by 100-fold, are now and have been since the GM crops were established, at levels where they poison us. And because that's what they do, they poison animals to stop them from being eaten. So it's so convoluted.
It does feel as though we're only at the beginning of being able to try.
Yeah, I'm reminded.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, Chris,
I'm reminded of the word that coming back to me from my basic cellular biology of homeostasis, and it's establishing a sort of an ongoing, established homeostasis that actually sort of provides an environment and actually is part of the environment. That's the formation that actually, sort of everything adapts to and copes with in a particular mix at that time. And it's that re-establishing that homeostasis away from our sort of chemical and biological inputs that we've been throwing in for years. And also, it occurred to me that that homeostasis is part of whatever indigenous culture of us humans were involved with when we were there. You know, we were actually sort of products of that soil. We were actually part of that homeostasis, and we dislocated ourselves to these sterile environments now. So,
actually, I love what you're saying, Ona, because underneath it, I can hear this thing where I think you said disassociated, but actually it's more than disassociation. It's actually disgust. You know, those people were called savages, and we had disgust for the way that they lived and eated and conducted themselves. So it's not just a return to homeostasis in a simple way. It would be a revision of this hierarchy, you know, which means that we are disgusted by those people who are living in a more natural state.
It's curious. I'm just reflecting on. There's currently a race, not a race. Well, there are plans to go to Mars. One of the things you have to do when you go to Mars is be able to grow food. And so the whole issue of what is a sustainable microbiome, both for the individuals and also for the food growing culture that they're going to have to develop there, will put this pretty much in at the top of the agenda in terms of science and technology. And I'm just wondering what might be rediscovered as that rather extreme environment is going to ask us to create the ecosystem at all levels that is indeed going to be sustainable. And we might be talking about, you know, access to very, very big data analysis. So, you know, we talked about the microbiome analysis, maybe revealing some pictures and patterns, but it'll be so horrendously complicated that things like artificial intelligence will be necessary in order to extract the correlations and patterns which indicate health and well-being. I know we've moved quite away from the kind of racial stuff here, but I think that's I mean, actually, next, of course, we talk about the race of Martians that we will be creating.
The human, yes, human plus, isn't it? It's H plus people. Genetically modified humans in order to cope with Martian environment. Yeah. A new species emerges.
Yeah, yeah.
Going back slightly to that cleanliness.
But the new species.
Sorry, Richard. I'm breaking up here.
Can I carry on? No, please.
I'm losing my connection a bit here. I was going a bit fuzzy. I was just saying, going back to the cleanliness question.
Biome.
Yeah, I just wondered whether Alice's third point about COVID-19 and the impact of that is that making us all be a lot cleaner and more towards a sterile environment. Because, you know, everybody's wiping everything down everywhere, and we're not meeting people, we're keeping away from things. And we've all sort of got this slightly changed culture now about cleanliness. Is that going to have a big impact on our microbiome?
It would be interesting then, have we got a kind of track and trace thing going, not for the virus, but for the biomes? What might emerge as people become more isolated? Are our microbiomes held in well-being because we interact with each other, not just with, if you like, our soil and local environment? I don't know how that might work.
Well, that's a very good point, because
Yeah.
pre-COVID, we might well have shared our sort of microbiomes through all kinds of bodily fluid interaction that we don't now. And in a sense, we don't embrace each other anymore. We don't go kissing strangers, however much we might not have done that in the past anyway. But, you know, that kind of contact, even touching people, transfers some kind of microbiome. And it's quite interesting to recognize that the microbiome does extend to what's on your skin. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's a great kind of analogy, I think, about when Saddam was the leader in Iraq. He was this very dominant, if you like, bacteria, and what he did was suppress all the other factions, and if you like, they are budding bacterial groups. And I think that there's a kind of a you know, an analogy across where kind of that's what's happening with disinfection, if you like, and cleanliness is kind of dominating, but it doesn't just dominate, as you've implied, the COVID, it dominates all of the bacterial kind of microbiome. And I think that something that Richard was implying was this alternative form of dominance, which is where you have masses of competing bacteria or factions, and because of those massive amounts of kind of competition within the factions, nothing reaches dominance. And then if you take that into a situation, for example, with antibiotics, because antibiotics is like a cleanser, it's like a sterilizing fluid. But what you have then, when you have this situation of keeping everything down, is that actually something can rise out of the factions or the mass of bacteria. And just like with antibiotics, it can completely take over, which was happening in the hospitals with, I can't remember what it was called. There's a number.
C. difficile and MRSA and all that.
And which we have in us all the time. But because people were taking antibiotics, something like that could rise up to a state that it started killing people. So I think that what you're saying, Richard, is about what do you do? Do you have this mass, a kind of creative kind of pool of bacteria all competing with each other and therefore nothing coming to dominance? Or do you have sterile conditions? And I think you captured it brilliantly with what you said.
Oh, I forgot what I said.
About, you know, this shaking hands, this contact, this kind of keeping alive of this kind of mass of kind of bacterial pool and connecting with each other with it.
That also points towards the whole issue of tolerance, actually, on a sociological level. That a diverse cultural mix creates all sorts of emergent richness, which a monoculture inevitably completely squishes. I mean, there is actually on the political scene over in the States, there's a real risk that the Republican Party could actually disappear off its own backside. In which case the kind of relative balance of a kind of two-party state might no longer be there, and it could be a bit of an issue. So actually having a rich political as well as a social culture, as well as a microbiological culture, is kind of key, actually.
Yeah, and it's fabulous because what you've done is you've kind of really seen it as this link between power, the maintenance of power. You know, and whether you have an opposition, the value of the opposition, or whether you have one party that dominates everything. And I think that it's fantastic because the two are just right there.
Yeah, and the arrogance of a monoculture is really a significant learning point here, I suppose. We are a living example of what happens when you have a diverse culture.
Yeah.
I mean, in ourselves, our body,
Yes,
a
yes.
diverse culture.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Hmm.
Oh, I think are we being,
I'm just going
did
to
I see a
close.
thing that just said we're about to rejoin or something?
Fairly soon, I think I'll close down now and we've got a minute to go then. Yeah.
Right. Yes, neat breakout room.
All right.
It's, yeah, I think this cultural richness thing is actually a very powerful metaphor, but the thing is, it doesn't let it, it's not easy to analyze. Actually, it's very messy.
Yeah.
Hmm. We are stuck with that.
Yeah, I mean, as an
Sorry, Chris, you go
Sorry,
ahead.
Chris, you were just saying,
I was going to say, as an ex-Londoner, I was always thinking how you know how rich London was in as far as change and mixing of ideas because of its multicultural nature. And I must say, living now in Devon, I miss that. It has a sense of fertility
Yes.
of different aspects and diversity, which I think is something we.
A Guardian article that, well, I don't know, Shiv, do you want to talk about the article you were just talking about? I think you'd be able to do a better job than I, well, I don't mind summarizing.
I was just actually discussing that the uptake of support and PCR tests, etc., is not quite as large in areas where, you know, the Black and ethnic minority areas where workers are actually what would you say, front-facing workers, porters and stuff, they don't get the time to go off and have tests, PCR tests. Whereas the wealthier suburbs, where the jobs are different and people actually get time to go off, it's more of an uptake in those resources. And I gave the example of my daughter, who's a mental health nurse, who gets given time to go and have a PCR test, actually got a pack of PCR tests to herself, and also given time to go and have a vaccine, which she had yesterday. So it depends on your strata in society, the job you do, and the support and the access you can have to resources, really, as is life, really.
We also talked about research on medicines and what research on medicines hasn't controlled for race and what that might impact, how that might impact the research that has been done. We also talked about autoimmunity and its high prevalence in Black communities, and the importance that education has in educating white people about the experiences of people of color and how that's a very important part of you know, making things better for everyone. So does someone else from another group want to come and explain what that group was speaking about? I don't know what the other groups were.
We got talking about issues to do with soil, actually, and how it is that the soil is being denuded of its richness. Somewhere along that conversation, we talked about, I wonder what it's like if you were to look at the culture of gardeners, people who get their fingernails dirty and are interacting with the soil, hopefully healthy soil, on a regular basis. Maybe they would have be an interesting subculture in their own right, of whatever ethnic background. So big queue there for allotments, perhaps, especially in urban areas. So we kind of went off on an interesting tangent to do with the wider environmental microbiome and how connections with that are really pretty important, because and not just the environment, but also in the connection in context of COVID, how we're no longer touching other people. So our skin biomes aren't busily exchanging interesting little messengers of variety, and variety, and for variety read richness, and because the richness and tolerance, if you will. Tolerance is quite an important thing in terms of establishing the sort of homeostasis that is the measure of a kind of a healthy system. You know, there's always this competing element, but somehow or other, if you've got a sufficiently rich environment, it kind of balances itself out magically. So a bit of a metaphor there about richness and tolerance and health and well-being.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you. Was there 2 other groups or 1 group? Like, maybe it was 2. I don't know. Yeah, does someone else want to come forward from the groups?
Well, I was in a group with Elizabeth and Ted and Janet, and we touched on the fact that this has raised COVID, and your study has raised opened a whole universe of inquiries where there are far more questions than answers, basically. So we're all thinking a lot about how this you've got a sort of issue dense environment basically has been opened up here. But then we got on, which we all agreed with, but then we got on to more specific questions about you know, the issue, your third question about the issue of your own race. And so we're all white people in that room, and we're thinking to ourselves, blimey, well, no one's asked that question before. And it's a sort of, it's a symptomatic of a systemically racist society that, you know, we've all been brought up not to even think about that, or to be able to formulate that sort of question. And so, you know, we acknowledge the need of an inhibition of empathy, which is needed in that front to guide this research. And we touched on the benefits of community gardens, and then we were just getting on to the enormous issues of agroecological production systems and decolonizing agriculture, which means essentially addressing the question of expropriated lands from indigenous peoples all over the world and so forth, and all their consequences for. So, and then the plug was pulled on our group. Maybe someone else would like to add something I missed there.
I think you did that very well. I just think one thing, just picking up on what Ian said before we broke out, the idea of understanding the biome in a community. One thing over the years, there's been lots of discussion about how people should have better diets, etc. But there's very little research on a community basis about what different diets and different practices, or well, we don't know about it, about what different practices people do have. So I live in East Central Bristol, and it's a very diverse area with lots of different culinary and other practices. We don't know how much people, without kind of knowing that they're being wholesome or good for their biome, actually ferment food or make pickles and all the rest. They probably do, because that's a trait that comes over. And if you look at Hungarian and Polish people, they're always pickling, have done for generations. So you know, maybe we need to understand a little bit more about what people do and look at that from a systems point of view, rather than always go straight to policy about improvement. So there's something like that, but yeah, the key one was about empathy. And you know, if you want to change policy, instead of trying to say we must do this for other people, what about doing it in the context of we all understand what our food relationship is, and that might help improve some of the take up of food policy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Does anyone have any points that they want to talk about or discuss further?
I'm just wondering whether there's some sort of psychology involved with the microbiome as well. When I first sort of got to learn that there's probably 5 kilograms of bacteria floating around in me, and I'm a very composite thing rather than a single individual. It takes a bit of time to get used to that idea. I'm not sure I like the idea of inhabiting a system with so many other things in it. And what is my relationship psychologically to my microbiome? And and then that leads on to what relationship psychologically do I have to other people's microbiomes, you know, rather than distinct from themselves as a person. And is this an element of sort of how we divide people up and see people as different to ourselves, that we're not seeing them as just a single individual now? We actually recognize that they embody a lot more, and their microbiome could well be a manifestation of the culture they come from rather than themselves. I think that's, I think, Alice, what you've done is open up so many channels of thinking, and
Yeah.
future research is going to keep many people in business for many years. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It goes on and on. Wow.
It is.
Thanks. Yeah.
There's a whole kind of understanding about religion and politics and kind of culture around purity and danger. There's a book by Mary Douglas. I don't know whether it's considered, you know, good stuff nowadays, but it's an anthropology book from the writing from the 60s or something. But the idea of invasion and not being complete does inhibit us to understand how we sit as people, as bodies within our wider context. So I used to be a lambing shepherd, and one of the things that I used to do as one of the tools of my trade was to look at the poo of the flock. I wouldn't know whose is whose, but I'd get an idea about, you know, what the condition of the flock was if I saw a particular kind of you know, nature of residue or whatever. And so but when I explain that to people, they would just say, but surely you're interested in what they're eating, or, you know, that you do all sorts of other tests. But actually, these days, our archaeologists spend a lot of time looking at middens. So, you know, there's a real sense of, and that is about the biome, isn't it, really? That's about what are they finding within it that's left behind, either the food and other stuff behind. I was just attending a discussion about Vikings yesterday with the Bristol Historical Association, and that's what they're looking at middens. So you are actually in time, and the right time. There's probably a lot more that could be developed from this. In terms of inequalities of health, then that needs to make sure that the people that are looking at health have this wider systemic view, and there's always people in public health that are interested in that. So you know, I think there's a fertile ground for this kind of discussion to go further.
Ian, what you were saying about thinking about your human self and your non-human self almost, I think that's it's kind of like a concept that I talk about in my PhD. Philosophically, the microbiome is very interesting for what does it mean for our sense of self if we are non-human and human, and we need this non-human part of us to function properly. It kind of does put into question, like, how are humans different to animals, and are we different, and is that distinction important? But yeah, that was, yeah, and yeah, so
I put in the chat early on, there's a sense in which you're looking at the biome from the point of view of a specific set of questions. But the biome probably, I mean, we don't know whether it's got a mind or not, how it operates, but it's an other than human kind of, you know, it could respond much better to completely different interrogation. We might learn completely different things. That's fascinating on a philosophical basis. So yeah, I'd be interested in finding out more about what that is.
Adriana, you put your hand up.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I just realised, because of what Ted was saying, that actually there's research that we know that this kind of hypoglycemic interaction between the microbiome and the brain feeds what was currently called hangry, which is this this kind of emergency about eating. And we know that there's kind of grey matter, if you like, in the stomach, and that this connection between the bacteria in the stomach and the brain is well documented. And there's a relationship between kind of sugar addiction and violence. kind of, which is there's a psychological link, because different people's response to this kind of hangry and their relationship with food. So the kind of the story about class and food, it feeds into a lot of different stories within society.
Yeah.
Wait, when you say stories about society, could you expand a bit more on that?
So, for example, one of the stories we have about people who are in prison are disassociated from their context, if you like, disassociation, which is demonizing. They are characters without a past, or without a context. And so if we begin to open up and we look at their diet, for example, and we look at the way that they're brought up and the way that their diet has affected them. For example, we know that children who are hungry can't concentrate, and we know that they will then experience educational deficiency. We know that this will exacerbate their feelings of being cornered or intimidated by the main culture, and their diet will then continue to feed into their story, which is one where of kind of low economic status. So I think that food, it seems to be apparent, or kind of it seems to be self-evident, but in fact not so. And by looking, but we know that, you know, people in prison, for example, you know, we know that they're deficient in so many things, you know, coming from food into kind of education, etc., into, somebody else mentioned, you know, frontline jobs. And then there's stories underneath that about, you know, how they got into that position. But if we have a society which needs to have frontline workers, then in a sense it's not in our interest to discover their stories, because we might accidentally displace them and allow them to somehow start telling new stories or understanding their position.
Yeah, I think definitely thinking about prison populations, like what their food is interesting, and another kind of way in which the prison system fails prisoners is the poor dietary conditions. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Does anyone else have any other comments or feedback?
Yeah. I suppose I'm just interested in where you would like to take this. Sorry.
Oh, what, the research that I've presented?
Yeah. And this, I mean, it can be a conversation offline. I've sent you a message.
Okay.
I think it would be interesting to see how that can be taken forward. I mean, obviously the Schumacher, we can take stuff forward as individuals and as a group, but it'd be interesting to see what you think would be your next steps. You don't have to rush towards policy, but you know, that's kind of where I am partly. So I'm just interested.
Yeah. Well, in the immediate future, I've got to write my PhD, which is pretty awful at the moment. But in the future, yeah, I think policy would be very interesting, or some sort of think tank situation. But I am very interested in the kind of social politics of health, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, can't really think that far ahead right now.
I know. Okay.
But thank you for that question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've asked us some good ones. Do pick up my contact details. I'll be nice to talk sometime. And when
Yeah. Sure, that'd be great. Yeah, great.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And Ian, were you going to say something?
I was going to pretty much say the same as Ted and ask you what happens next. Where does this go? And there are so many streams of thinking that could actually come out of it. I was even reminded of the sort of concepts of morality that come out of thinking about some of the issues when we look at the microbiome and consider it in the context of disgust and contamination, and the fact that I'm going back to my psychology about it again, and a lot of it is to do with waste products as a way of understanding the microbiome, and how that sort of has throughout the centuries affected our philosophy and our morality concepts. So I think there's huge number of different streams and pathways to take from this research, Alice, and I just wondered, as Ted did, what happens next. But it's certainly going to be a rich field for a long time. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I mean, we're getting to past now, so it's the kind of end of the workshop. Unless anyone else has anything else to add, we could say our goodbyes. I've enjoyed this experience very much. Thank you very much for having me, and for everyone attending. I've enjoyed it immensely. It's been really helpful for me, and it's been great to hear everyone's feedback. So I hope everyone else has enjoyed it. But yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you.
No,
Very thought-provoking.
Fascinating topic. It's opened up lots of things. Sorry, what was that, Jen?
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say it was very thought-provoking, and good luck with the rest of your PhD, Alice.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Good luck.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Keep an eye on Ian's emails, because he'll be sending out emails about future events. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, thank you, Alice, for opening up such a rich and interesting topic.
Great. Thank you then.
Thank you.
Right. Cheers all.
Bye.
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 Thanks, Alice.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye.
Go and feed the
Okay.
microbiome.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. There's to copy this chat. It sounds so fascinating chat.
Yeah. Oh, yes, must save that one.
Can I
Yeah.
copy it?
Yeah. There we go.
Don't know if it's letting me copy it. Yeah, I think I've copied it. Yes, yes.
Wow, there's some nice links in there as well.
Okay.
Right.
Look, yeah.
See you then.
Okay.
Yep.
Bye. See you
Bye.
soon.
See you soon.